Right guys, question 3 is a 16 marker on custodial sentencing. Don't skip the 16 marker. I know that it's not the most pleasant task in the world, but it needs doing. So, if you need a bit of time to recap custodial sentencing, then by all means do a bit of revision first, but then come back to the question and give it a go. So, this is your question. Now I'm going to show you my plan first, and then we'll have a look at the full essay once we've gone through the plan. Straight away, it's a bit of a tricky question because it only wants you to focus on the psychological impact of custodial sentencing rather than on custodial sentencing overall. So keep that in mind when you're writing, because too much information about other stuff will mean that your answer loses focus and you'll lose marks. Okay? So this is what I'm going to do. In my outline, I'm going to talk about stress and depression, institutionalization, and prisonization. They're the 3 psychological issues that custodial sentencing can cause. Now, there are some bits where I can add a bit more detail, like stress and depression and institutionalization, and that's where a lot of my detail marks will come from. Different books have got different content, but any book that you're working from should have 3 or more negative consequences of being in prison that you can talk about. I'm then going to use 3 evaluation points, and all of them focus on the negative impact of custodial sentencing. Okay, so some of them support the idea that there are negative impacts, and they'd be my strengths, and some of them challenge the idea of the negative impacts, which would be my limitations. I've then also got a little bit of a discussion point, which looks at the alternative methods to custodial sentencing and why they might be good. Remember, this is a discuss question, so you do need strengths and limitations, and you need a little bit of backwards and forwards. Obviously, these evaluation points are selected specifically because they link to the psychological impact of custodial sentencing, and if the question was different, then you might use different points. Okay, but these ones are specifically for this question. So let's have a look at the model answer. So here's my outline. First of all, it covers all 3 issues that I mentioned in my plan. The first 2 getting a little bit more attention and a little bit more detail in terms of research being mentioned and names being thrown in and that kind of stuff. The outline comes out at around 175 words, so it's a nice length to get kind of all the detail in that you might need. I've then got my 3 evaluation points. So I've got my research support for the negative psychological effects on prisoners. I've then got the counterpoint, which I've extended a little bit. And then I'm finishing off with my discussion point. 3 evaluation points is plenty to produce a level 4 answer, and if you can get them in that kind of detail, then you will be absolutely fine. Now, before we finish off, while we're here, I've added a standard essay on custodial sentencing as well, so that you can see what the difference would be if you didn't have to focus on the psychological impact of prison. This one hasn't come up in an exam yet, but it makes a lot of sense to cover it here while we're looking at this topic. Okay, so I've just changed the title to Discuss Custodial Sentencing as a Way of Dealing with Offending. Now you can see in my outline that the focus has shifted to the purpose of prison sentences, and I've still got a little bit about the psychological impact, but I've kept it to stress and depression rather than talking about all 3, because I just need to give a flavour for the fact that there are negative psychological effects. Okay, the reason I've chosen stress and depression is because I still want to use my evaluation point that I used in my last essay. Okay, my evaluation points have largely stayed the same, except I've added in some research support for rehabilitation programs and their effectiveness for offenders. Now, something to note is that my second evaluation point, which is the same evaluation point as I used in my last essay, but it's changed slightly because in the first essay, it was research support for the negative impact of prisons, and I was using it as a strength because it supports the theory that prisons have a negative psychological impact. In this essay, however, I'm going to be using it as a limitation because it's highlighting that prisons may not be effective because of the negative impact they have on people. Okay, so it's pretty much the exact same point. I've just changed the wording ever so slightly so that it's now challenging the effectiveness of prisons rather than supporting the negative psychological impact of prisons. Okay, so just keep an eye on the wording there. All right. So this is what it would look like. So there's my outline. In blue, it's a little bit longer than the last one because there are more points to cover. It comes out at about 190 words instead of 175. And then I've got my 3 evaluation points with the counterpoint in red. Okay, you might also notice that the counterpoint is slightly shorter than it was in the last essay. That's because I've added a whole new point to the essay, so I shortened the counterpoint and just kind of took out some of the bits that I might not need. Okay, it's still plenty for a counterpoint. It still does the job. It still challenges the point that came before it. It's just slightly shorter because we've got that new point in there, which is the green one. So I hope that's been useful. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the next one.